I'm not paying $2,576 a month. The woman at the podium said it loudly enough that several people in the gallery turned their heads. I didn't look up right away. I finished reading the income affidavit in front of me and placed the document flat on the bench. "Ma'am," I said, "you reported earning $180,000 last year." She leaned closer to the microphone like she was correcting a mistake. "That's my income," she said, "not something the court gets to take." The room settled into that quiet courtroom silence where every chair movement feels louder than it should. Across the room, the father of the child sat at the opposite table with his attorney. He hadn't spoken since the hearing began. His hands stayed folded on the table in front of him. I slid the guideline worksheet slightly forward on the bench. "This hearing," I said, "is about child support." She shook her head immediately. "No, it's about you trying to take my money." Her attorney shifted beside her, lowering his voice. "Miss Parker, please," but she raised a hand to stop him. "I know my rights." I watched the exchange without interrupting. The bailiff stood against the wall to my left, arms folded, eyes moving quietly between the podium and the bench. I turned one page in the case file. "Let's walk through the numbers," I said. Her shoulders tightened. "I already told you, ma'am." My voice stopped her mid-sentence. "You'll have the chance to speak. Right now I'm reviewing the record." She took a breath through her nose and leaned back slightly from the microphone. I continued. "You earn approximately $15,000 per month. That's before taxes." "Understood." I tapped the guideline worksheet once with my pen. "In this state, child support is calculated from gross income." She laughed quietly under her breath. "That's ridiculous." The father's attorney stood. "Your Honor, the state guideline worksheet has already been submitted as Exhibit B. I have it." I lifted the paper slightly so both tables could see it. "Based on the income reported and the parenting schedule filed with the court, the calculated obligation is $2,576 per month." The number hung in the air for a moment. Then she leaned forward again. "No," it wasn't loud this time, just firm. "No." Her attorney slowly closed the folder he had been holding. "Ma'am," he said under his breath, "that's the statutory guideline." She ignored him completely and kept her eyes on me. "That amount is insane." I rested the pen on the bench. "You're welcome to explain why you believe the guideline calculation is incorrect." Her expression changed slightly. "I shouldn't have to pay that much when I'm already successful." The father finally shifted in his chair, not speaking, just moving slightly as if the sentence had landed somewhere heavy. I looked at her again. "Child support isn't based on success or failure." She folded her arms across her chest. "It's punishment." "No." I slid the guideline chart toward the edge of the bench where the overhead document camera displayed it on the monitor beside the jury box, though there was no jury here today. "Just the parties. The calculation reflects income and the needs of the child." She shook her head again. "You're saying because I worked harder I have to give away more money." Her attorney spoke again. "Miss Parker, the court is explaining the statute." "I don't care about the statute." The words came out sharper this time. The bailiff shifted one step off the wall, just enough movement to remind everyone he was there. I kept my tone even. "You're free to argue for a deviation from the guideline." She leaned in again. "I am." "Go ahead." She took a breath. "His father should be paying more." The father's attorney immediately stood again. "Your Honor, my client earns $42,000 annually. Those records were submitted with the financial disclosure." "I have them." She waved her hand dismissively toward the other table. "He barely makes anything." The father's posture stayed still, eyes down on the table. I flipped the page in the file and looked back up. "That's already reflected in the calculation." Her frustration was starting to show physically now. Her fingers tapped once against the podium. "I'm not writing a check for $2,500 every month." I corrected her calmly. $2,576. She pointed at the worksheet on the screen. "Whatever it is." "I'm not paying it." The room went still again. Her attorney leaned slightly toward her. "You're not refusing a request," he whispered. "You're responding to a court order." She looked back at him. "Then the order's wrong." I picked up my pen again and placed it on the margin of the worksheet. "Do you have evidence the income figures in this document are incorrect?" "No." "Do you dispute the parenting schedule filed with the court?" "No." "Then what specifically is incorrect about the calculation?" She paused. For the first time since the hearing started, she didn't answer immediately. "I just don't agree with it." The father shifted slightly again in his seat. The gallery behind them, two relatives and a caseworker, remained completely still. I placed the worksheet back on the bench. "Agreement isn't required." Her eyes widened slightly. "You can't just decide that." "I don't decide the formula." I pointed lightly at the guideline chart. "The legislature already did." She looked at the screen again, then back at me. "You're telling me the state can just take money from someone who worked for it?" I watched her carefully. "This order isn't about the state." She said nothing. "It's about the child." Her posture stiffened again. "I already provide for my child." The father's attorney spoke quietly. Your Honor, the current temporary support order has not been paid for 3 months. Her head snapped toward him. That order was temporary and unpaid. I raised one hand slightly to stop the back and forth. Let's stay focused. I turned back to her. Is there any additional financial evidence you'd like the court to review before I issue a final order? She stared at the worksheet again. Then she shook her head. No, I lifted the pen. The sound of the pen touching paper echoed softly through the room. She watched the movement closely now. What are you doing? Entering the order. Her shoulders straightened. You're actually signing that? Yes. The bailiff remained still beside the wall. Her attorney didn't move either. He simply watched the document as I finished writing. When I set the pen down, the order was complete. I slid the paper forward. Child support is ordered in the amount of $2,576 per month. She stared at the page like the number had changed. Effective immediately. The room stayed quiet. Her expression shifted slowly from disbelief to something heavier. Then she looked back up at me. You're serious? I nodded once. The father didn't react outwardly, but the way his shoulders lowered slightly told me he understood what had just happened. The bailiff stepped forward to hand the signed order to the clerk. Papers moved quietly across the desk. I closed the file in front of me. The hearing was finished. As the parties began gathering their documents, she was still staring at the page in her hands. And for the first time since she walked into the courtroom, she wasn't arguing anymore. She was still standing at the podium when the clerk handed her the signed order. She looked down at the paper again, then back up at me like she expected the number to change if she asked one more time. 2,576, she repeated quietly. Her attorney leaned toward her. Miss Parker, that's the final order. She didn't move. Across the room, the father slowly collected the documents from his table. He stacked them carefully, almost cautiously, like he didn't want to draw attention to himself. She shook her head once. This is unbelievable. Her voice wasn't loud anymore, just stunned. I opened the case file again to confirm the order had been entered correctly. The amount is calculated from the financial disclosures both parties submitted. She looked toward the father for the first time since the hearing began. You're really going to take that much from me? He didn't answer right away. He simply looked back at her. It's not for me. The words were quiet, but they carried across the room. She turned back toward the bench. I already buy everything she needs. I rested my hands on the edge of the bench. Child support is intended to ensure the child benefits from the financial resources of both parents. Her attorney gently tapped the order in her hand. This is standard when income levels are this different. She exhaled sharply through her nose. That number is ridiculous. The clerk finished stamping the file and slid it aside. I watched her for a moment. Do you intend to appeal the order? She blinked. What? If you believe the calculation is incorrect, you have the right to file an appeal. She looked down at the paper again. You're telling me that's my only option? That's the process. The bailiff remained standing beside the courtroom door, quiet and still. She looked back at her attorney. Do people actually pay this much? He nodded slightly. Yes, she shook her head again. This system is broken. Her attorney didn't respond. The father finally stood up from his table. He walked slowly toward the clerk to receive his copy of the order. Neither of them spoke as the papers were exchanged. When he turned back toward the exit, he paused for a moment beside the defense table, not confronting her, just stopping briefly. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the document. Then he continued walking toward the courtroom doors. The bailiff opened one side quietly. The hallway outside was bright compared to the courtroom lighting. When the door closed again, the room returned to that steady courtroom silence. I closed the case file completely now. Anything further from either party? Her attorney stood. No, Your Honor. I looked toward her. She was still staring at the number printed in bold on the order. For a moment I wondered if she was going to argue again. Instead, she slowly folded the paper, carefully, like she was trying to accept that it was real. Her attorney placed a hand lightly on the back of her chair. We should go, she nodded once. When she turned away from the podium, the anger that filled the room earlier wasn't there anymore, just disbelief. The bailiff opened the door again as they walked toward the exit. And as the courtroom emptied, the signed order remained on record, $2,576 a month. The door closed behind them, and the courtroom settled into its usual quiet. The clerk placed the stamped order into the file and slid it toward the stack of completed cases for the morning. I remained seated behind the bench for a moment, reviewing the final page. Through the glass panel in the courtroom door, I could see movement in the hallway outside. Miss Parker hadn't left yet. She was standing a few feet from the door with the folded order still in her hand, speaking quietly with her attorney. Her voice wasn't raised anymore. Inside the courtroom, the father was still near the clerk's desk, receiving his copy of the paperwork. He thanked the clerk quietly and turned toward the exit. When he stepped into the hallway, he paused when he saw Miss Parker standing there. Neither of them spoke at first. The bailiff opened the door slightly to allow him through. From where I sat, I could see them both through the narrow gap in the doorway. She unfolded the order again and pointed at the number. Even from a distance, the gesture was unmistakable. 2,576. Her attorney spoke calmly beside her, explaining something while pointing at the document. The father didn't interrupt. He just listened for a moment. Then he nodded once, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. He adjusted the folder under his arm and walked down the hallway toward the elevators. Miss Parker remained where she was, still staring at the page. Eventually, her attorney folded the paper again and placed it back in her hand. A few seconds later, they began walking in the opposite direction. The bailiff gently closed the courtroom door. Inside, the clerk finished organizing the paperwork from the hearing. I signed the final entry on the docket and handed the file down from the bench. Next matter, the clerk checked the schedule. 10 minutes, Your Honor. I nodded and leaned back slightly in the chair. Family court hearings often ended quietly like this, not with shouting or confrontation, just a number written on a page that suddenly made everything real. Outside the courtroom, the hallway noise faded as the two parties walked in different directions. Inside, the file with the signed order was placed neatly on the clerk's desk. $2,576 a month, entered into the record. The clerk placed the file in the outgoing tray and checked the schedule again. I could still see movement through the narrow glass window in the courtroom door. Miss Parker hadn't gone far. She was standing near the hallway bench now, the order unfolded again in her hands. Her attorney stood beside her, speaking quietly and pointing to the section where the calculation was printed. Inside the courtroom, the father had already reached the elevator area down the hall. He didn't look back. Miss Parker leaned against the wall for a moment, reading the document again from the top. Income, parenting schedule, guideline calculation. At the bottom of the page, my signature, $2,576 per month. Her attorney said something else, likely explaining when the first payment would be due. She lowered the paper slowly. Even from a distance through the glass, I could see the moment it settled in. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was an order. The bailiff stepped back to his position by the wall as the clerk finished preparing the next file. I closed the case docket in front of me. Family court rarely ends with applause or dramatic reactions. Most of the time it ends like this. A number written on a page, a quiet hallway, and two people walking away in different directions knowing that, starting today, that number becomes part of their lives every single month. The hallway outside eventually grew quiet. A few minutes later, the bailiff glanced through the glass panel again and then stepped back into his place beside the wall. "They've both left, Your Honor," he said calmly. I nodded and reached for the next file the clerk slid toward the bench. But before opening it, I noticed something left behind on the podium, a folded sheet of paper. The clerk walked over and picked it up. "It's the guideline worksheet," she said, "the same one we had displayed on the screen during the hearing." She placed it on the edge of the bench so I could see it. The calculation was still circled in pen. $2,576 per month. The numbers hadn't changed. They never do once the financial disclosures are entered and the formula is applied. I closed the file from the previous hearing and pushed it toward the clerk for record entry. "Make sure both parties receive certified copies of the order," I said. "Yes, Your Honor." The bailiff opened the side door as the clerk called the next case into the courtroom. People began filing in again, different parents. Different financial disclosures, different arguments waiting to happen, but the process would be the same: income, guidelines, and order. The clerk gathered the leftover worksheet from the podium and placed it inside the case file before moving it to the completed stack. As the next hearing began, the record from the previous one remained exactly where it belonged, a signed order, $2,576 a month, filed, stamped, and entered into the court record. The next case stepped forward, but the clerk paused for a moment as she organized the stack of files beside her. The folder from Miss Parker's hearing sat on top of the completed pile. My signature was still fresh on the last page. Across the courtroom, the podium stood empty again, exactly where she had been standing only a few minutes earlier arguing about the number. Now the room looked completely ordinary. The clerk slid the file into the storage tray, where all finalized orders go before being transferred to the records office. Once it was placed there, the process was finished. The order existed independently of the conversation that had happened around it. Outside the courtroom, the hallway traffic had already returned to normal. People walked past the benches. Attorneys reviewed notes with their clients. Elevator doors opened and closed at the far end. Inside the courtroom, the bailiff announced the next matter on the docket. Another parent stepped toward the podium. Another financial disclosure waited inside the file. I opened the new case folder and looked down at the first page. different names, different numbers, but the process would follow the same path it always does. Income, guideline calculation, an order entered into the record. Behind me on the clerk's desk, the previous file rested quietly among the others. Inside it, the sign page still read exactly the same: child support ordered in the amount of $2,576 per month.